Welcome back. In this video, we're going through the Resident Evil 3 story step by step. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Let's get started. The 28th of September, 1998, day 1. The city of Raccoon City stood on the brink of catastrophe. What had begun as isolated incidents in the Arklay Mountains months earlier had now consumed the entire urban center. The T-virus, a mutagenic bioweapon developed by the Umbrella Corporation, had spread throughout the population, transforming citizens into mindless, flesh-eating creatures known as zombies. Jill Valentine, a former member of the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, found herself trapped in her apartment as the crisis reached its peak. The once elite STARS unit had been all but disbanded after reporting their findings about Umbrella's illegal experiments at the Spencer Mansion. Few believed their story about bioorganic weapons and corporate conspiracy. Now, as Jill prepared to flee the city, the truth of their warnings became impossible to deny. The apartment building shook with the sounds of chaos outside. Jill gathered her equipment, checking her handgun and securing supplies. She had been investigating Umbrella independently since the mansion incident, gathering evidence to expose their crimes. But time had run out. The city was falling faster than anyone had anticipated. As Jill made her way through the apartment complex, she encountered the infected everywhere. Former neighbors, now transformed into grotesque parodies of humanity, stumbled through hallways and stairwells. The building itself showed signs of deterioration and panic. Overturned furniture, broken windows, and ominous bloodstains painted a picture of desperate last moments. Reaching the courtyard, Jill witnessed the full scale of the disaster. Fires burned across the skyline. Distant screams echoed between buildings. Military helicopters passed overhead, but they were not mounting a rescue, they were monitoring containment. The United States government had already made its decision about Raccoon City's fate. A massive explosion rocked a nearby building, sending debris cascading into the streets. Through the smoke and flames, Jill pressed forward, her training keeping her focused despite the nightmare surrounding her. She needed to reach the subway station, her planned extraction point from the city. Suddenly, an ominous presence made itself known. A heavy thudding sound, like massive footsteps, approached from behind. Jill turned to see something that defied comprehension. A towering, humanoid figure, over 8 feet tall, dressed in a black outfit with a distinctive wide-brimmed hat. Its face was grotesque, scarred and pale, with dead eyes that locked onto her with mechanical precision. This was the pursuer, though Jill would come to know it by another name, Nemesis, an advanced bioorganic weapon created by Umbrella with a specific mission: eliminate all remaining STARS members. Unlike the shambling zombies, this creature possessed intelligence, purpose, and an array of weaponry. It carried a modified rocket launcher and moved with terrifying speed despite its bulk. The creature's voice emerged as a guttural growl. STARS. Jill ran. The Nemesis pursued relentlessly, smashing through obstacles and firing its weapon with devastating accuracy. The rocket launcher's projectiles demolished portions of the street, creating new hazards as Jill desperately sought cover and distance. This was unlike any enemy she had faced before, persistent, powerful, and seemingly unstoppable. The chase led through the ransacked storefronts and burning vehicles of Raccoon City's downtown area. Jill used every tactical advantage available, cutting through buildings, triggering environmental hazards, and utilizing her knowledge of the urban terrain. But the Nemesis adapted, learning her patterns and cutting off escape routes. During a brief respite, Jill encountered other survivors. Brad Vickers, her former STARS colleague, appeared from an alley. The pilot looked haggard and terrified, having survived alone for days. Their reunion was cut short by the Nemesis's reappearance. The creature showed no interest in ordinary survivors. Its programming focused exclusively on STARS members. Brad and Jill split up, attempting to divide the creature's attention. It proved futile. The Nemesis pursued Brad with single-minded determination. Jill heard his screams and rushed to help, but arrived too late. The bioweapon had cornered Brad in a narrow alley. Despite Jill's attempts to draw its fire, the Nemesis executed its mission. Brad fell, another victim of Umbrella's ultimate predator. Grief and rage fueled Jill's escape as the Nemesis turned its attention back to her. She fled into the subway station, descending into the underground tunnels that networked beneath the city. The creature followed, undeterred by darkness or enclosed spaces. Its heavy footfalls echoed through the tunnels, a constant reminder that safety remained elusive. The subway system offered temporary advantages. Jill used the maze-like passages to create distance, navigating through maintenance areas and station platforms. But the Nemesis proved capable of adapting to any environment. It demonstrated problem-solving abilities far beyond normal bioorganic weapons, using tools and environmental features to continue its pursuit. In the depths of the subway, Jill encountered more infected. The T-virus had reached every corner of the city, transforming maintenance workers and stranded commuters alike. Additionally, new variants appeared, creatures that had undergone accelerated mutation in the damp, dark environment. Dogs with exposed muscle tissue and enhanced speed prowled the tunnels. These were the Cerberus variants, former security animals transformed into lethal hunters. Jill located an operational control room where she could access the subway's electrical systems. If she could restore power to certain sections, she might activate a train and use it to escape the underground area. Working quickly, she rerouted power and cleared blockages in the rail system. As she worked, she discovered communications equipment still receiving transmissions. A voice came through. Members of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service were operating in the city. This private military unit, known as UBCS, had been deployed ostensibly to rescue civilians and contain the outbreak. However, their true purpose remained unclear. Were they genuine rescuers or another layer of Umbrella's conspiracy? The power restoration triggered unexpected consequences. Lights throughout the subway system activated, but so did various security systems and sealed areas. Jill heard new sounds of movement, more infected, drawn to the light and noise. And somewhere in the distance, that familiar heavy footfall resumed. The Nemesis had not given up. Jill reached a subway platform where a train waited. She started the engine and prepared to depart. But the Nemesis arrived with impeccable timing. The creature boarded the train, forcing a confrontation in the confined space of the passenger cars. Jill fought desperately, using explosive barrels and heavy equipment to create barriers and damage the bioweapon. The battle culminated in a massive explosion that derailed the train. Both Jill and the Nemesis were thrown from the wreckage. Jill survived with injuries, but managed to crawl from the debris. The Nemesis, incredibly, also began to rise from the wreckage, demonstrating the terrifying resilience engineered into its design. Jill escaped into a new section of the city as the subway tunnels collapsed behind her. She emerged near the downtown area, closer to possible evacuation points, but also deeper into the heart of the infected zone. The 28th of September, 1998, evening. The streets of downtown Raccoon City presented a vision of apocalypse. Abandoned vehicles formed impromptu barricades. Bodies lay in the streets, some motionless, others beginning to stir with unnatural animation. The T-virus showed no mercy, reanimating the fallen to join the growing horde. Jill pushed forward through this hellscape, her ammunition running low and her body exhausted from constant combat and flight. She needed to find other survivors, weapons, and most importantly, a way out of the city before it was too late. She encountered a makeshift barricade where UBCS forces had established a temporary position. 3 soldiers manned the checkpoint: Carlos Oliveira, Mikhail Victor, and Terrell Patrick. These members of the private military company regarded Jill with initial suspicion, a lone civilian woman, armed and moving with military precision through a combat zone. Carlos Oliveira, a mercenary with distinctive long hair and an easy confidence despite the circumstances, took the lead in questioning Jill. She identified herself as former STARS. which immediately changed the dynamic. The UBCS. Soldiers had heard of STARS, though their knowledge of the unit's disbandment was limited. Mikhail Victor, the team leader and an older veteran with a strong sense of duty, explained their situation. The UBCS had deployed multiple squads throughout Raccoon City with objectives to rescue civilians and establish extraction points. However, communication with other teams had gone dark. Casualties were high. The mission was failing. Tyrell Patrick, the team's technical specialist, worked on repairing communication equipment and accessing Umbrella's encrypted networks. He suspected that the corporation was hiding information about the outbreak, including possible solutions or antidotes that could help survivors. The group agreed to cooperate. Jill's knowledge of the city and combat experience complemented the UBCS team's firepower and equipment. Their immediate objective was to reach a subway station where civilians had gathered, hoping to use the underground network to reach the city outskirts. As they moved through the streets, they witnessed the full horror of the outbreak's progression. Entire city blocks had been consumed by fire. Infected wandered in massive groups, drawn to noise and movement. Worse, new types of creatures had emerged. The hunters' reptilian bioweapons previously encountered at the Spencer Mansion now prowled Raccoon City's streets. These agile, deadly creatures possessed razor-sharp claws and pack-hunting intelligence. The group also discovered evidence of Umbrella's other experiments. Pale, humanoid creatures with long tongues and brain-exposed heads lurked in dark corners. These lickers represented another stage of T-virus mutation, demonstrating enhanced sensory capabilities and devastating close combat abilities. Their presence indicated that the virus was mutating rapidly, creating increasingly dangerous variants. Mikhail led the team with tactical precision, but even his experience couldn't fully prepare them for the variety of threats. During one engagement, a swarm of infected separated Jill from the others. She fought through alleys and building interiors, using her remaining ammunition carefully and scavenging supplies from abandoned stores and police stations. In a police station substation, Jill discovered evidence of the city's final hours before total collapse. Desperate messages from officers calling for backup that would never come. Evacuation plans that had failed before implementation. And troubling reports about a special unit deployed with orders to eliminate specific targets, likely a reference to the Nemesis program. Reuniting with Carlos and the others, Jill shared her information. Tyrell's suspicions were confirmed. Umbrella had multiple agendas in Raccoon City, beyond simple containment. They were testing weapons, gathering combat data, and eliminating witnesses to their crimes. The team reached the subway station to find it overrun. Dozens of civilians had gathered here days earlier, but the infected had breached their defenses. Bodies filled the platform, and the few surviving civilians were in various stages of infection or panic. Mikhail made the difficult decision to proceed with the evacuation attempt, despite the compromised situation. While Mikhail and Tyrell worked to secure the station and prepare a train, Carlos and Jill cleared infected from the tracks and surrounding areas. The combat was brutal and exhausting. For every zombie put down, more seemed to emerge from the tunnels and stairwells. During the battle, Jill's worst fear materialized. The distinctive sound of heavy footsteps announced the Nemesis's arrival. The bioweapon had tracked her across the city, pursuing its programmed objective with mechanical persistence. It emerged onto the subway platform, rocket launcher ready, focused entirely on eliminating its STARS target. Carlos witnessed the Nemesis for the first time and understood immediately why Jill had been so urgent about escaping. This was no ordinary bioweapon. The creature's size, armament, and obvious intelligence made it an extinction-level threat in an urban environment. The team engaged the Nemesis while trying to protect the surviving civilians. Mikhail ordered everyone onto the train, while he, Carlos, and Jill provided covering fire. The battle was desperate. The Nemesis shrugged off bullets and explosions that would have destroyed lesser creatures. It demonstrated new abilities, including a tentacle appendage it used to grab and crush obstacles. As the train prepared to depart, the Nemesis boarded despite the team's efforts. It moved through the passenger cars, destroying everything in its path. Mikhail made a fateful decision. He confronted the bioweapon directly, armed with explosives, and ordered the others to the front cars. As Jill and Carlos fled, Mikhail detonated the explosives in a massive blast intended to destroy the Nemesis and save the others. The explosion derailed portions of the train and collapsed sections of tunnel. Jill and Carlos were separated in the chaos, each thrown into different areas of the underground network. The Nemesis's fate remained uncertain. No body was visible in the wreckage, but surely nothing could have survived such devastation. The 29th of September, 1998, early morning. Jill regained consciousness in a collapsed section of tunnel buried under debris. Her body ached from the explosion and subsequent cave-in. She dug herself free and assessed her situation. Separated from Carlos and the others, low on ammunition, and deep underground with no clear path forward. The situation was dire. She navigated through the damaged tunnels, using emergency lighting and her own judgment to find a way up and out. The explosion had opened new passages while closing others, creating a labyrinthine maze. Infected wandered these tunnels as well, disoriented by the collapse, but no less dangerous. Jill eventually found a maintenance ladder leading to the surface. She emerged in an industrial area of the city, near power generation facilities and warehouse districts. The area was less densely populated than downtown, but infected still roamed in concerning numbers. She discovered a UBCS supply cache in a warehouse, complete with ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment. Using the radio, she attempted to contact Carlos or any other survivors. Static filled most channels, but she eventually received a response. Carlos had survived the train crash and was attempting to rendezvous with Tyrell at a clock tower location that was serving as a UBCS rally point. Jill made her way toward the clock tower through the industrial district. Along the route, she encountered more evidence of Umbrella's activities. Research facilities disguised as ordinary buildings, storage areas containing biological samples and experimental weapons. The corporation had been using Raccoon City as a testing ground long before the current outbreak. One facility contained files about the Nemesis program. Jill learned that the creature pursuing her was designated Nemesis T-type, an advanced bioweapon created by implanting a parasitic organism into a modified T-103 tyrant host. The parasite, called the Nemesis parasite, granted the host enhanced intelligence and the ability to use weapons and follow complex orders. Multiple test subjects had been created, though only a few had survived the integration process. The files also revealed the creature's primary weakness, the Nemesis parasite, while granting intelligence also created a vulnerability. Extreme trauma to the parasite could destabilize the host. However, achieving such trauma required firepower far beyond what Jill currently possessed. Leaving the facility, Jill pressed toward the clock tower. The route took her through a park area that had become a nightmarish garden. The T-virus affected plant life as well as animals, and the park's vegetation had grown wild and hostile. Massive roots burst through pavement, unusual plant growths blocked pathways, and a new type of creature lurked here, plant-based mutations that spat acid and grabbed unwary prey with vine-like appendages. Jill fought through this botanical horror and finally reached the clock tower as dawn broke over Raccoon City. The massive structure stood as a landmark in the city's older district, its Gothic architecture now seeming appropriate for the nightmare the city had become. Carlos greeted her at the tower's entrance, relieved to find her alive. Tyrell had established a command post in the tower's upper levels, using its height to maintain communication attempts and scout the surrounding area. Other UBCS survivors had gathered here as well, though their numbers were few, perhaps a dozen soldiers from the multiple squads originally deployed. The reunion was brief. Tyrell reported that Umbrella had ceased all communication with UBCS forces. The corporation had abandoned them, leaving the mercenaries to die alongside the civilians they were supposed to rescue. More troubling, Tyrell had intercepted military communications, indicating that a final solution for Raccoon City was imminent. Though the exact nature of the solution wasn't specified, the implications were clear: complete destruction of the city to eliminate all evidence of the outbreak. The survivors debated their options. A rescue helicopter had been dispatched by private parties aware of the situation, but it wouldn't arrive until the following day. They needed to survive until then and secure a suitable extraction point. The clock tower could serve this purpose if they could clear the surrounding area and mark the location properly. As they planned, a bell tolled from the tower's mechanism. The sound echoed across the city, a haunting reminder of normal life now lost. But the sound carried another consequence. It drew the infected in massive numbers toward the tower. Hundreds of zombies began converging on the location, drawn by the noise. The U, B, C, S forces prepared for siege defense, setting up barricades and establishing firing positions. Jill worked alongside Carlos, positioning explosive barrels and creating choke points to maximize their defensive advantages. The battle began as the sun fully rose, painting the city in harsh light that only emphasized its ruin. Wave after wave of infected assaulted the clock tower. The defenders held, but ammunition depleted rapidly. Casualties mounted as soldiers were overwhelmed or made fatal mistakes. Terrell coordinated the defense from the upper levels while also working desperately to complete the beacon that would guide their rescue helicopter. Hours into the siege, as defenders fell back to the tower's interior, the attack suddenly intensified. Not from more infected, but from a single source. The Nemesis had returned. The bioweapon emerged from the horde of zombies, having somehow survived the subway explosion. Its body showed damage, burns, and torn flesh, but it remained functional and focused on its mission. The creature had also evolved. Its injuries had triggered some transformation, giving it new capabilities. Tentacle appendages emerged from its body with greater frequency and control. It moved with even more speed and purpose, and it had abandoned its rocket launcher in favor of close combat tactics, perhaps recognizing the weapon's limitations in the tower's cramped quarters. Jill faced the Nemesis in the clock tower's courtyard, while Carlos and the others provided covering fire from above. The battle was desperate and close quarters. The bioweapon's tentacles lashed out with devastating force, destroying stone pillars and shattering windows. Jill used every trick and tactic she had learned: explosive barrels, environmental hazards, and precision shots to vulnerable areas. The fight culminated when Jill lured the Nemesis beneath the tower's massive bell mechanism. Carlos, understanding her plan, sabotaged the bells mounting from above. The massive bronze bell fell, crushing the Nemesis beneath tons of metal. The creature's roar was cut short as it disappeared beneath the bell, finally silenced. The defenders celebrated briefly, but Jill remained wary. She had seen this creature survive too much to assume it was truly dead. Nevertheless, with immediate threat neutralized and the infected horde thinning, the survivors could fortify their position and wait for rescue. The 29th of September, 1998, afternoon. The celebration proved premature. As Carlos and Jill caught their breath from the battle, the fallen bell began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing violence, something beneath pushed upward. The Nemesis emerged, further transformed. The crushing trauma had triggered another mutation phase. The creature's body had become more monstrous. Its intelligent features were degrading, replaced by more bestial characteristics. Additional tentacles sprouted from its torso. Its voice, which had clearly spoken S-T-A-R-S, before now emerged as barely recognizable roars. The Nemesis parasite was asserting greater control, sacrificing intelligence for raw power. This new form proved even more dangerous in close combat. Jill and Carlos were forced to retreat into the clock tower as the creature demolished the courtyard. Other U, B, C, S. Soldiers attempted to slow its advance, but were killed or scattered. The tower's defenses, designed to repel mindless infected, proved useless against this intelligent, powerful predator. Jill made a critical decision. She couldn't let this creature continue pursuing her and endangering everyone else. She would lure it away from the tower, giving the other survivors a chance to complete their preparations for extraction. Carlos objected strenuously, but Jill overruled him. She was STARS. The Nemesis wanted her specifically. She could use that. Jill fled the clock tower with the Nemesis in pursuit. She led it through the Old City district, using her knowledge and agility to stay ahead of its powerful but more direct approach. The creature smashed through obstacles and walls, taking the most direct path toward its target. The chase led to Raccoon City Hospital, a massive medical complex that dominated the Eastern District. Jill hoped to lose the creature in the building's maze-like layout, while also searching for medical supplies that might help the wounded survivors at the clock tower. The hospital had been overwhelmed early in the outbreak. It now served as a tomb for thousands who had sought help that never came. The infected filled every floor, former patients, doctors, nurses, all transformed into shambling horrors. The hospital's unique environment had also created specialized mutations. Infected in various states of medical treatment had transformed with equipment still attached, creating grotesque combinations of flesh and medical apparatus. Jill navigated through emergency rooms and surgical suites, each revealing new horrors. Operating tables with patients who had transformed mid-surgery, isolation wards where infected clawed at sealed doors, maternity wards that Jill refused to fully explore, unwilling to face what she might find there. In the hospital's research wing, Jill discovered something unexpected evidence that doctors had been working on a T-virus vaccine before the outbreak overwhelmed them. Laboratory notes described successful tests on infected mice and preliminary human trials. A functional vaccine existed, though only in small quantities. Jill located the vaccine samples in a secured laboratory freezer. Multiple vials remained intact, enough potentially to treat several infected individuals if administered quickly after exposure. She secured the vials, recognizing their immense value. The Nemesis caught up to her in the research room. It had tracked her through the hospital with relentless determination. The creature's mutations had progressed further. Its body was becoming increasingly unstable, trading coordination for raw power. It was degrading, but this made it more dangerous, not less. Another battle ensued in the laboratory. The fight destroyed years of research as equipment was shattered and chemicals spilled. Jill used gas lines and electrical systems as weapons, creating explosions and hazards that would have killed a normal organism many times over. The Nemesis endured, regenerating from injuries that should have been fatal. Jill finally escaped by triggering the laboratory's emergency sterilization system, a controlled burn designed to eliminate biological contaminants. The intense flames engulfed the Nemesis as Jill fled through an emergency exit. Behind her, she heard the creature's roars mixing with the roar of flames. Surely this time it was finished. Emerging from the hospital, Jill found herself in a new area of the city, the Spencer Memorial Park district. This upscale residential area had been less affected by the initial outbreak, but was now thoroughly overrun. The park itself, a large green space in the city's heart, had become a dead zone filled with infected and more exotic mutations. As Jill made her way back toward the clock tower, she received a radio call from Carlos. The situation had deteriorated. Tyrell had been wounded defending the tower, and some of the other survivors showed signs of infection. The vaccine Jill had found could save them, but she needed to return quickly. Jill pushed through the infected hordes, her determination overriding her exhaustion. She had the vaccine, and people were counting on her. The city threw every obstacle in her path, collapsed buildings, burning vehicles, massive groups of zombies, but she persevered. Reaching the clock tower, Jill found Carlos had stabilized the situation. He had treated Tyrell's wounds and isolated those showing infection symptoms. When Jill produced the vaccine, Carlos's relief was visible. He had medical training and could administer the treatment. Carlos worked through the night, treating the infected survivors. The vaccine proved effective when administered early enough. Several soldiers who would have died or turned instead stabilized and began recovering. Tyrell, despite his injuries, survived and continued coordinating their evacuation plans. The group now faced a new timeline. The rescue helicopter was confirmed for the next evening, but they also received confirmation of the rumors the government was planning a sanitization protocol for Raccoon City. The exact method remained classified, but the implication was clear. A missile strike or similar action would be taken to eliminate the outbreak and all evidence. They had perhaps 24 hours before Raccoon City ceased to exist. The 30th of September, 1998, dawn. The final day in Raccoon City began with an uneasy calm. The infected seemed less active in the morning hours, perhaps affected by some aspect of the virus's progression, or simply because most had already died in the previous day's chaos. The survivors at the clock tower used this lull to prepare for evacuation. Carlos and Jill discussed their next moves. The helicopter would land at an extraction point outside the city's main infection zone, requiring them to travel through several miles of urban nightmare. They would need to move as a group, protecting the wounded and conserving ammunition for the journey. Terrell, despite his injuries, had made significant progress hacking Umbrella's encrypted networks. He had discovered something crucial evidence of Umbrella's complete involvement in creating and spreading the T-virus. Names, dates, financial records, and experimental data. This information could bring down the corporation if it reached the right authorities. However, the data was stored in a secure facility deep within the city, the Nest Laboratory, a massive underground research complex beneath Raccoon City. Umbrella had built this facility years ago, conducting their most sensitive research away from oversight. The facility contained backups of all research data, including evidence of their crimes. Jill, Carlos, and Terrell debated the risk versus reward. Entering the Nest could provide the evidence needed to destroy Umbrella and prevent future outbreaks. But it would also consume time they didn't have and expose them to unknown dangers in an Umbrella research facility. The wounded survivors needed immediate evacuation, not delays for data collection. They reached a compromise. Carlos would lead the main group of survivors to the extraction point. Jill and Tyrell would make a rapid infiltration of the Nest, gather what evidence they could, and then proceed to the extraction point themselves. The rescue helicopter would wait as long as possible, but if the sanitization protocol began, it would depart without them. Carlos objected to this plan, wanting to accompany Jill, but she convinced him that his combat skills and medical training were needed to get the wounded survivors to safety. Tyrell, despite his injuries, was the only one who could access Umbrella systems and extract the data quickly. The group divided. Carlos led the main survivor group south toward the extraction coordinates, while Jill and Tyrell headed toward the NEST's concealed entrance in the industrial district. The two parties wished each other luck, unsure if they would meet again. Jill and Tyrell's route took them through the most devastated parts of Raccoon City. Entire blocks had burned to foundations. Bodies filled the streets in such numbers that navigation required constantly stepping over or around the dead. The infection had reached its final stages here. Some areas contained so many zombies that they formed nearly solid masses of undead flesh. The Nest entrance was hidden in an Umbrella subsidiary building disguised as a water treatment plant. Tyrell accessed the security systems and opened the concealed elevator that descended into the facility. The descent took several minutes, indicating the Nest's incredible depth beneath the city. The facility was enormous, an underground complex with multiple levels dedicated to different research projects. Emergency lighting provided minimal visibility, and the facility showed signs of evacuation. Umbrella had pulled out their key personnel and abandoned the rest to die with the city. However, the facility had not been completely abandoned. Automated security systems remained active, and worse, the experimental subjects kept here had escaped containment. The Nest housed some of Umbrella's most dangerous bioweapon prototypes, and they now roamed free. Jill and Tyrell encountered hunters of a variant more advanced than those on the surface, sleeker, faster, and equipped with blade-like appendages. They found evidence of failed experiments, creatures that hadn't survived the development process, but had been reanimated by exposure to virus samples in the facility. Tyrell led them to the main data center, a massive server room containing Umbrella's complete research archive. He began downloading files, while Jill secured the area. The download would take time. There were terabytes of data to copy. While waiting, Jill explored nearby laboratories. She discovered the full scope of Umbrella's madness. Dozens of bioweapon programs running in parallel, human test subjects subjected to grotesque experiments. Plans for deploying these weapons globally once perfected. The T-virus was just one of multiple virus projects, and the Nemesis was one of several intelligent bioweapon programs. One laboratory contained information about the Nemesis specifically. Jill learned that multiple Nemesis units had been created, though only one had been deployed in Raccoon City. The program aimed to create bioweapons capable of independent operation in urban combat scenarios, with STARS selected as test targets due to their combat experience and Umbrella's desire to eliminate witnesses to the mansion incident. The file included a critical detail: the Nemesis unit deployed in Raccoon City had been expected to degrade after approximately 72 hours of continuous operation. The mutations Jill had witnessed were part of the creature's deterioration as the Nemesis parasite consumed the host body. Eventually, the creature would become completely unstable and destroy itself. However, the file also noted that an unstable Nemesis unit could remain extremely dangerous, even in its final stages, potentially exhibiting enhanced aggression and unpredictable abilities before final degradation. Tyrell completed the data download and secured the files on encrypted storage devices. They now had the evidence needed to expose Umbrella, assuming they could escape the city and deliver it to authorities not corrupted by the corporation. As they prepared to leave the nest, alarms sounded throughout the facility. Not security alarms, but something worse: containment failure warnings. The automated systems, losing power and functionality, could no longer maintain the seals on the facility's most dangerous specimens. Jill and Tyrell ran for the elevator as they heard massive containment doors opening throughout the complex. Behind them, roars and screeches announced the release of things that should never have been created. The nest was spilling its secrets in the worst possible way. They reached the elevator and ascended toward the surface, but the facility pursued them. A massive creature, something far larger than any bioweapon Jill had previously encountered, began climbing the elevator shaft after them. She caught glimpses of it in the flickering emergency lights, a pale, massive form with multiple limbs and a distinctly insectoid appearance. The elevator reached the surface level and opened in the disguised facility. Jill and Tyrell fled as the creature below continued its pursuit. They rigged the elevator shaft with explosives from the facility's storage, hoping to collapse the shaft and seal the nest permanently. The explosion brought down the building's entrance structure, burying the elevator shaft under tons of concrete and steel. Whatever had been pursuing them was trapped below, at least temporarily. The nest would keep its remaining secrets, but Jill and Tyrell had what they came for. The 30th of September, 1998 evening. The journey to the extraction point took Jill and Tyrell through the industrial district's heart. Time was running short. The sanitization protocol could begin at any moment, and Carlos's group had a significant head start. They encountered infected in reduced numbers, suggesting that the virus had largely run its course in this area. Most potential victims had already been transformed or killed. The city felt increasingly like a tomb, its silence broken only by distant groans and the crackling of fires. Tyrell's injuries were catching up to him. The exertion in the nest had reopened wounds, and he struggled to maintain their pace. Jill supported him, but she knew they needed to reach the extraction point quickly, or risk missing the rescue entirely. As they approached the industrial district's edge, near the river that bordered Raccoon City, the distinctive sound of rotor blades reached them. The rescue helicopter was approaching, right on schedule. Hope surged they might actually escape this nightmare. Then Tyrell stopped. He pointed toward a massive industrial building ahead, one of Umbrella's waste disposal facilities. Smoke poured from its chimney stacks, and the ground trembled with some activity inside. Something was happening there, something related to Umbrella's final protocols. Against her better judgment, Jill agreed to investigate. If Umbrella was destroying evidence or unleashing something new in their final hours, controlling the city, they needed to know. Tyrell theorized that the facility might be incinerating research materials before the sanitization protocol. They entered the facility to discover something far worse. Umbrella had installed an emergency bioweapon disposal system in this building, a massive incinerator designed to destroy failed experiments and contaminated materials. The system was now active, attempting to eliminate evidence before the city's destruction. But the disposal system had been damaged in the outbreak. Instead of safely incinerating materials, it was releasing them partially destroyed into the surrounding area. Deformed creatures, some still burning, emerged from damaged disposal chutes. The facility had become a nightmare factory, spewing horrors with every malfunction. Worse, the facility's core systems showed signs of critical failure. The incinerator's temperature had exceeded safe levels, and containment was failing. If the system exploded, it would scatter biological contaminants across a wide area, potentially spreading the infection beyond Raccoon City's borders. Jill made a decision. They needed to shut down the facility properly, ensuring complete incineration of all materials before they left. It would cost time, but releasing these contaminants could doom surrounding communities to Raccoon City's fate. Terrell, despite his weakening condition, worked on the facility's control systems, while Jill held off the creatures spilling from damaged sections. The battle was exhausting. These partially destroyed bioweapons fought with the desperation of dying animals, unpredictable and vicious. As Tyrell worked, a familiar sound echoed through the facility. Heavy footsteps, accompanied by inhuman roars. The Nemesis had found them again. The creature emerged from the smoke and shadows, barely recognizable as the being it had been. Its mutations had progressed to the point of complete transformation. The intelligent bioweapon was gone, replaced by something more akin to a massive predator operating on pure hunting instinct. This final form of the Nemesis was enormous, barely fitting through the facility's industrial passages. Tentacles and mutated limbs sprouted from its body in profusion. Its face had become an inhuman horror, dominated by massive jaws and dead eyes. But it still recognized Jill, still pursued its original programming, even as its mind degraded into pure aggression. Jill faced the creature one last time. This battle would determine everything if she fell here. The evidence Tyrell carried would likely die with him, unable to escape alone with his injuries. The sanitization protocol would destroy Raccoon City, Umbrella would cover up their crimes, and future outbreaks would follow. The fight was apocalyptic. Jill used the facility itself as a weapon, luring the Nemesis into industrial equipment and hazardous areas. She triggered crushers, exposed electrical systems, and diverted caustic chemicals onto the creature. Each injury seemed to make it more aggressive rather than weaker, as if the dying organism was raging against its end. Tyrell completed his work on the control systems and called out that the incinerator was ready for emergency purge, a complete burn that would destroy all remaining biological materials, but would also consume the facility itself. Jill needed to reach the exit before activation. She made a final dash for safety as the Nemesis pursued. Behind her, Tyrell activated the purge sequence and then collapsed, his injuries finally overwhelming him. Jill turned back, unwilling to leave him, but he waved her forward. Someone had to deliver the evidence. Someone had to survive to tell the truth. The Nemesis caught up to Jill at the facility's exit. One final confrontation, with the incinerator's heat rising and fire spreading through the building. Jill emptied her remaining ammunition into the creature's mass, aiming for what she hoped were critical areas. The Nemesis roared and reached for her with massive tentacles. At that moment, gunfire erupted from outside the facility. Carlos had returned with several UBCS soldiers, having heard the battle and come back for Jill and Tyrell. Their combined firepower drove back the Nemesis, giving Jill the opening she needed to escape. But Tyrell remained inside, too injured to move. He threw the encrypted storage devices containing Umbrella's data to Jill, ensuring the evidence would survive even if he didn't. Then he triggered a manual override, accelerating the incinerator's purge. Jill, Carlos, and the soldiers fled as the facility exploded behind them. The massive blast consumed everything: the building, the biological materials, and the Nemesis. The creature's final roar was cut short as the explosion vaporized its unstable form. After days of relentless pursuit, the Nemesis was finally destroyed. Tyrell died in the explosion, a sacrifice to ensure the contaminated materials were completely eliminated. His last act saved potentially thousands of lives in surrounding communities. The 30th of September 1998, night. The survivors ran toward the extraction coordinates as Raccoon City began its final countdown. Government forces had initiated the sanitization protocol, multiple missiles were inbound, designed to completely destroy the city and eliminate all trace of the T-virus outbreak. The rescue helicopter waited at the designated coordinates, a clearing near the river just outside the city's main boundary. Other survivors had gathered there, civilians and UBCS, personnel who had fought their way out of the nightmare. Carlos had led his group to safety and then returned for Jill, risking his life one final time. Jill reached the helicopter and climbed aboard, carrying the encrypted storage devices that contained evidence of Umbrella's crimes. Around her, other survivors boarded, each one a miracle of persistence and luck. They had endured impossible odds and emerged alive. As the helicopter lifted off, Jill looked back at Raccoon City. The place had been her home, and now it was a dying monument to corporate greed and unchecked ambition. Fires burned across the entire urban area. The infected wandered streets they no longer recognized. And somewhere in that chaos, the Nemesis's remains smoldered, a final testament to the horrors Umbrella had created. The missiles arrived. Multiple warheads struck the city simultaneously, creating a series of massive explosions that joined into a single apocalyptic blast. The helicopter shook from the shockwave as Raccoon City was consumed by fire and force. In seconds, everything was gone. Buildings, streets, the infection, and all evidence of what had occurred. Except for what Jill carried. The encrypted devices held the truth, and she would ensure that truth reached the world. Umbrella had destroyed Raccoon City to hide their crimes, but they had failed to eliminate all the witnesses. The helicopter flew into the night, leaving behind a crater where a city had stood. Over 100,000 people had died in Raccoon City, victims of the T-virus, victims of Umbrella's ambition, victims of a tragedy that should never have occurred. Jill Valentine sat in the helicopter, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. Beside her, Carlos Oliveira and the other survivors struggled with their own reactions to survival. They had escaped Raccoon City, but they would never escape the memories of what they had witnessed. The pilot reported their destination, a government facility, where they would be debriefed and the evidence secured. Jill held the storage devices tightly. This was what Tyrell had died to preserve, what Brad had been killed trying to escape from, what Mikhail had sacrificed himself to protect. The evidence would expose Umbrella. It would reveal the corporation's biological weapons programs, their human experiments, their willingness to sacrifice entire cities for their research. The data contained irrefutable proof of crimes that demanded justice. As the helicopter disappeared into the night, Raccoon City burned behind them, a funeral pyre for a city and a warning to the world about the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. The T-virus outbreak had been contained through the most extreme measures, but the threat remained. Umbrella Corporation still existed, still possessed their research and weapons, still posed a danger to humanity. Jill Valentine and the other survivors had escaped Raccoon City, but their fight against Umbrella was just beginning. The nightmare of September 1998 would haunt them forever, driving them to ensure such a tragedy never occurred again. They had survived the impossible, and now they would seek justice for those who hadn't. The helicopter vanished into the darkness, carrying the last survivors of Raccoon City toward an uncertain future, while behind them, the fires slowly died, leaving only ash and silence where a city had stood. The 1st of October 1998, early morning. The helicopter touched down at a military airfield 200 miles from Raccoon City's coordinates. Armed personnel surrounded the aircraft immediately, weapons drawn and biohazard suits evident even in the darkness. The survivors were escorted from the helicopter into a secured quarantine facility that had been hastily established in the airfield's hangar. Jill and the other survivors underwent immediate medical examination. Teams of military doctors and CDC personnel conducted blood tests, physical examinations, and exposure assessments. The fear of T-virus infection spreading beyond Raccoon City drove these procedures. Every survivor represented a potential vector for renewed outbreak. The examinations were thorough and invasive. Blood samples were drawn repeatedly. Body temperature was monitored constantly. Any sign of infection would result in immediate isolation and, Jill suspected, possibly terminal quarantine measures. The government had just destroyed an entire city to contain the virus. They would not hesitate to eliminate infected individuals. Jill tested clean. The vaccine she had administered to herself during the crisis, combined with her lack of direct exposure to infected bodily fluids, had protected her. Carlos and most of the other UBCS soldiers also showed no signs of infection. A few civilians required observation, but initial tests suggested they too had avoided contamination. While medical teams processed the survivors, government agents began interrogations. Men in dark suits with military credentials questioned each survivor separately, documenting their experiences and gathering intelligence about the outbreak's progression. The questioning was intense and skeptical. The survivors' accounts of bioorganic weapons and intelligent monsters strained credulity for those who hadn't witnessed them. Jill's interrogation lasted for hours. She recounted everything: the mansion incident, the STARS investigation, Umbrella's cover-up, and the events in Raccoon City. She described the nemesis in detail, knowing how unbelievable it sounded. A 8-foot-tall bioweapon that used weapons and pursued specific targets with intelligence and persistence. The interrogator's skepticism faded when Jill produced the encrypted storage devices from the nest. She explained that these contained Umbrella's complete research data, including evidence of their bioweapon programs and human experimentation. Tyrell Patrick had died to secure this evidence, and it would prove everything she claimed. The devices were immediately seized and taken to technical specialists for analysis. Government cryptographers began working to break Umbrella's encryption, though Jill had warned them that Tyrell had mentioned the security would be extensive. It might take days or weeks to access the full data. Carlos underwent similar interrogation, corroborating Jill's account and providing his perspective as a UBCS operative. He revealed that many of the mercenaries deployed to Raccoon City had been kept ignorant of Umbrella's true nature. They believed they were conducting legitimate rescue operations, not realizing they were expendable assets in Umbrella's containment and data gathering efforts. The other surviving UBCS soldiers confirmed Carlos's statements. Umbrella had deployed them with minimal information, using them to test bioweapon performance in combat scenarios and gather tactical data. The corporation had never intended to extract the U, B, C, forces they were meant to die alongside the city, eliminating witnesses and loose ends. News of Raccoon City's destruction had already reached the media, though the official story bore little resemblance to reality. Government spokespeople reported a catastrophic industrial accident at a chemical plant, resulting in toxic contamination that necessitated evacuation and controlled demolition of unstable structures. No mention of biological weapons, viral outbreaks, or corporate malfeasance appeared in official statements. The survivors watched news broadcasts in their quarantine quarters, seeing sanitized footage of the city's destruction and carefully crafted explanations that avoided any hint of the truth. The government and Umbrella were cooperating in a massive cover-up, rewriting history to hide the real cause of over 100,000 deaths. Jill felt rage building as she watched officials lie with practiced ease. The people of Raccoon City were being erased, their deaths attributed to an accident rather than corporate crime. The survivors were being silenced through quarantine and intimidation, and Umbrella continued operating as if nothing had happened. She demanded to speak with whoever was in charge of the investigation. After hours of resistance, she was finally brought before a military intelligence officer who identified himself only as Colonel Roberts. He had authority over the Raccoon City incident response and survivor management. Jill confronted Roberts about the cover-up, demanding to know why the truth wasn't being revealed. His response was coldly pragmatic. Public disclosure of biological weapons and viral outbreaks would cause mass panic. Markets would crash. Faith in government and corporate institutions would collapse. The social and economic damage could exceed even the tragedy of Raccoon City itself. Moreover, Roberts explained, Umbrella Corporation was deeply embedded in government and military structures. They held contracts for legitimate pharmaceutical and medical research. They employed thousands of people. They had connections throughout the political establishment. Simply shutting them down based on evidence from a destroyed city would be complicated and potentially impossible. The government's strategy, Roberts revealed, was more subtle. The encrypted data from the Nest would be analyzed and used to build a comprehensive case against Umbrella. Charges would be brought quietly, targeting specific individuals rather than the entire corporation. The truth would emerge gradually through legal proceedings rather than immediate public disclosure. Jill found this approach inadequate and cowardly, but Roberts made clear she had no choice in the matter. She and the other survivors would remain in quarantine indefinitely, officially for medical reasons, but effectively to prevent them from speaking publicly about their experiences. The survivors were now classified witnesses in an ongoing investigation, subject to government control. The quarantine facility became a prison dressed in medical justification. Guards monitored the survivors constantly. Communication with the outside world was prohibited. Family members were told the survivors required extended medical observation. Days passed with no change in status and no indication of when they might be released. Carlos and Jill discussed escape options, but the facility's security made such attempts nearly impossible. Armed guards, restricted access points, and their uncertain legal status all conspired to keep them contained. They were trapped again, this time not by monsters, but by bureaucracy and secrecy. October 1998, weeks later. 3 weeks after escaping Raccoon City, the survivors remained in quarantine. Medical justification had long since evaporated. All tests showed no infection or contamination. But the government maintained the quarantine under national security provisions, keeping the survivors isolated while analysts worked on the encrypted Nest data. During this period, Jill learned fragments of information about what was happening beyond the facility. Government cryptographers had broken portions of Umbrella's encryption, revealing damning evidence of illegal bioweapon development. Multiple government agencies were now involved in investigating the corporation, though their efforts remained classified. Media coverage of Raccoon City had faded from headlines, replaced by other news as the public moved on. The official story of an industrial accident remained unchallenged. A few conspiracy theorists posted online about government cover-ups and biological warfare, but they were dismissed as cranks with no credible evidence. Some survivors struggled with the extended confinement. Civilians who had endured the nightmare of Raccoon City only to be imprisoned afterward suffered psychological breakdowns. Military personnel provided counseling, but the fundamental injustice of their situation could not be addressed through therapy. Carlos maintained optimism through dark humor and planning for the future. He discussed what he would do when released, expose Umbrella publicly if necessary, seek employment that didn't involve bioweapons, and try to rebuild a normal life. His confidence helped sustain other survivors during the darkest periods. Jill focused on documenting everything she could remember about Umbrella's operations and the Raccoon City outbreak. She wrote detailed accounts of the Spencer Mansion incident, the Nest facility layout, and the Nemesis program. These documents might serve as testimony in future legal proceedings, or as evidence if official channels failed to bring justice. One night, Colonel Roberts visited Jill with unexpected news. The government had successfully decrypted significant portions of the Nest data, revealing the full scope of Umbrella's crimes. Multiple bioweapon programs, human experimentation, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to conceal criminal activities. The evidence was overwhelming. However, Roberts explained, prosecution would be complicated. Umbrella's leadership had already begun destroying evidence and preparing legal defenses. Key personnel had fled to countries without extradition treaties. The corporation was fragmenting, with subsidiaries declaring independence and denying knowledge of the parent company's activities. The government intended to proceed with charges against Umbrella executives and scientists, but the process would take months or years. In the meantime, survivors would be released from quarantine but required to sign non-disclosure agreements. They could resume their lives but could not speak publicly about Raccoon City or Umbrella's bioweapons until legal proceedings concluded. Jill refused to sign such an agreement. She had not survived Raccoon City to be silenced by legal technicalities. The public deserved to know what Umbrella had done, and the survivors deserved to tell their stories without restriction. Roberts made clear that refusal to sign would result in continued indefinite detention on national security grounds. The government possessed legal authority to hold her without charges if they deemed her a security risk. She could cooperate and regain her freedom with restrictions, or refuse and remain imprisoned. Carlos and several other survivors faced the same choice. Some signed the agreements, desperate to return to their families and lives. Others refused, unwilling to be complicit in covering up the truth. The survivor group fractured based on individual decisions about this impossible choice. Jill ultimately signed the agreement under protest, calculating that freedom with restrictions offered more opportunities to expose Umbrella than continued imprisonment. She could work within the system while secretly preparing for the moment when she could reveal everything. The non-disclosure agreement had limits and loopholes that a determined person might exploit. November 1998. Jill Valentine walked out of the quarantine facility into a cold November morning. She had been confined for over a month, and the world outside had moved on from Raccoon City. The news cycle had buried the story under layers of other events. Most Americans, if they thought about Raccoon City at all, remembered it as a tragic industrial accident in a mid-sized Midwestern city. She returned to her apartment, which had been maintained by government personnel during her absence. Everything was exactly as she had left it the night she fled. Raccoon City clothes still in the closet, dishes still in the sink, mail piled up inside the door. It felt like returning to a life that belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't witnessed what she had seen. Carlos had also been released and stayed in contact despite the non-disclosure restrictions. The former UBCS mercenary was attempting to rebuild his life while also quietly gathering information about Umbrella's ongoing operations. The corporation was fragmenting but not disappearing. Various divisions and subsidiaries continued operating under new names and management. Jill learned through Carlos that several other STARS members had also survived various encounters with Umbrella's bioweapons. Chris Redfield, her former partner, had escaped the Spencer Mansion incident and was conducting his own investigation into the corporation. Others from STARS, Alpha and Bravo teams were scattered across the country, some trying to expose Umbrella, others trying to forget. The government's prosecution of Umbrella proceeded slowly through classified legal channels. Indictments were filed against several executives and scientists, but most had fled or disappeared. The corporation's assets were being seized, but the process was complicated by the company's international operations and complex corporate structure. Meanwhile, evidence suggested Umbrella, or its successor organizations, continued bioweapon research in secret facilities beyond U.S. jurisdiction. The destruction of Raccoon City had eliminated one research center, but the knowledge and resources that created the T-virus and Nemesis remained in circulation. Jill struggled with civilian life after Raccoon City. Simple activities felt meaningless compared to the life and death struggles she had endured. She suffered nightmares about the Nemesis, waking in terror from dreams where the creature still pursued her through endless burning streets. Survivor's guilt plagued her. Why had she lived when over 100,000 others died? She attended support groups for disaster survivors, though she could never speak truthfully about what she had experienced. The non-disclosure agreement prevented her from sharing the real trauma, forcing her to couch her experiences in vague terms that missed the essential horror. How could she explain being hunted by an intelligent bioweapon to people who thought she had merely escaped an industrial accident? Carlos faced similar challenges. The former mercenary had lost comrades in Raccoon City and struggled with guilt over his role in Umbrella's operations. Though he had been ignorant of the corporation's true nature, he still felt responsible for contributing to their crimes through his UBCS service. Together, Jill and Carlos formed an informal alliance. They shared information about Umbrella, tracked rumors of bioweapon incidents, and prepared for the day when they could speak publicly. The non-disclosure agreement had an expiration tied to the conclusion of legal proceedings. Once trials ended or charges were dropped, they would be free to reveal everything. They also connected with other survivors and witnesses to Umbrella's crimes. A network formed of STARS members, UBC personnel, civilian survivors, and former Umbrella employees who had developed consciences. This network shared information and evidence, building a comprehensive picture of the corporation's global operations. Through this network, Jill learned that Raccoon City was not an isolated incident. Umbrella had conducted bioweapon experiments in multiple locations worldwide. Other outbreaks had occurred and been covered up. The T-virus was only one of several biological agents the corporation had developed. The full scope of Umbrella's crimes dwarfed even the Raccoon City disaster. December 1998. As winter arrived, Jill received a cryptic message through the Survivor Network. Someone wanted to meet with her, someone who claimed to have information about Umbrella's current operations and future plans. The message provided coordinates for a meeting in a neutral location, a public park where they could talk without electronic surveillance. Jill approached the meeting with caution, suspecting a trap or a government monitoring operation. She arrived early and observed the location, looking for signs of surveillance or ambush. The park appeared normal, families enjoying winter activities, joggers on trails, nothing suspicious. The contact arrived precisely on time. A woman in her 40s, well-dressed and professional, carrying a briefcase. She introduced herself only as a friend and got directly to business. She was a former Umbrella researcher who had worked on antiviral programs before fleeing the corporation after learning the truth about their bioweapon development. The researcher provided Jill with documentation showing that Umbrella's remnants were reorganizing under new corporate structures. Key personnel had transferred their knowledge and resources to successor organizations that maintained the same research objectives. The bioweapon programs would continue under different names and management. More troubling, the researcher revealed that the government's prosecution of Umbrella was deliberately limited in scope. Political pressure from corporate allies and concerns about economic disruption had resulted in a negotiated settlement rather than comprehensive justice. Most Umbrella executives would avoid serious punishment in exchange for cooperation and asset seizure. The researcher had left Umbrella because she could not accept this outcome. She wanted to provide evidence to someone who would use it properly, someone who had seen firsthand what Umbrella's creations could do. She believed Jill would ensure the truth eventually reached the public, regardless of non-disclosure agreements or government pressure. Jill accepted the documentation, understanding the risk the researcher was taking. This evidence could restart her life just as she was beginning to find stability. But she also knew she couldn't ignore information that might prevent future outbreaks. Too many had died in Raccoon City for her to choose personal comfort over justice. The researcher left quickly after transferring the documents, advising Jill to protect the information and herself. Umbrella successor organizations would not hesitate to eliminate threats, and Jill's status as a Raccoon City survivor made her a potential target. Jill returned home and examined the documentation carefully. The evidence was extensive financial records showing asset transfers to new corporations, personnel files, tracking researchers moving to new facilities, and research proposals for continuing bioweapon development under the guise of defensive countermeasures. She copied the documentation and distributed it through the Survivor Network, ensuring that if anything happened to her, the information would survive. She also began developing a plan for eventually releasing this evidence publicly when legal restrictions expired or circumstances demanded immediate action. Carlos helped analyze the documentation using his UBCS contacts to verify information and identify patterns. Together, they mapped Umbrella's successor organizations and tracked their activities. The picture that emerged was troubling. The corporation had not been destroyed, merely reorganized. The threat remained active. Months later, 1,999. The government's prosecution of Umbrella concluded with minimal fanfare. Several executives received prison sentences, but most were short terms in minimum security facilities. Scientists faced professional sanctions, but avoided criminal punishment by claiming they were following orders or were ignorant of how their research would be used. The corporation itself was dissolved, its assets distributed among various buyers and successor companies. The settlement was declared a success by official spokespersons, presented as holding a rogue corporation accountable while avoiding economic disruption. The public, largely unaware of the true scale of Umbrella's crimes, accepted this narrative. Raccoon City remained officially an industrial accident, its victims unnamed casualties of corporate negligence rather than bioweapon experimentation. Jill's non-disclosure agreement technically expired with the conclusion of legal proceedings, but government officials made clear that revealing classified information about bioweapons would still result in prosecution under national security laws. The freedom to speak came with implied threats about the consequences of doing so. She and Carlos debated whether to go public with their evidence despite the risks. They could potentially expose the cover-up and reveal Umbrella's true crimes to the world. But such action would likely result in their arrest, confiscation of evidence, and possible imprisonment. They would become martyrs, but might not achieve the transparency they sought. They chose instead a longer strategy. They would maintain the survivor network, continue gathering evidence, and prepare for the right moment to reveal everything. Meanwhile, they would work through legitimate channels, contacting journalists, building relationships with honest government officials, and documenting everything for eventual public release. Jill also committed herself to preventing future outbreaks. She trained extensively in counter-bioweapon tactics, studied virology and biochemistry, and maintained peak physical condition. If Umbrella's successors deployed bioweapons again, she would be ready to respond. The nightmare of Raccoon City had transformed her from a police officer into a specialized operative focused on combating biological threats. Carlos pursued similar objectives, using his military experience and UBCS training to become an expert in bioweapon countermeasures. He worked with organizations developing defensive technologies and response protocols for biological threats. His experience in Raccoon City made him uniquely qualified to advise on realistic scenarios and effective responses. The Survivor Network grew over months and years, incorporating more people who had encountered Umbrella's bioweapons or witnessed the corporation's crimes. Former employees, survivors of other incidents, and family members of victims all contributed to a growing archive of evidence and testimony. This network operated carefully, aware that Umbrella's successors monitored for threats to their continued operations. Communications were encrypted, meetings held in secure locations, and information distributed widely enough that no single arrest or incident could destroy the collected evidence. Jill maintained contact with Chris Redfield and other former STARS members who shared her commitment to exposing bioweapon threats. Together, they formed an unofficial organization dedicated to investigating and countering biological warfare. They had no official status or authority, but they had knowledge, experience, and determination that government agencies lacked. The Raccoon City incident remained officially classified as an industrial accident, its true nature hidden from public awareness. Over 100,000 people had died, their deaths attributed to toxic exposure rather than viral infection and bioorganic weapons. The survivors who knew the truth were scattered, bound by legal agreements and practical concerns to keep their knowledge secret. But the truth had not been buried completely. Evidence existed in encrypted files, personal testimonies, and documentation gathered by survivors and former Umbrella employees. This evidence waited for the moment when it could be safely revealed without triggering government suppression or corporate retaliation. Jill Valentine carried the memories of Raccoon City with her always. The faces of those who had died, Brad Vickers, Mikhail Victor, Tyrell Patrick, and countless others whose names she never learned. The horror of the outbreak and the relentless pursuit by the nemesis. The corruption and conspiracy that allowed such a disaster to occur. These memories drove her forward. She would not let Raccoon City be forgotten or its lessons ignored. She would continue fighting against bioweapon proliferation, exposing threats wherever they emerged, and working toward the day when the complete truth could be revealed without fear of suppression. Carlos Oliveira shared this commitment, transforming from a mercenary who fought for pay into an activist who fought for justice. His experiences in Raccoon City had shown him the consequences of following orders without question and working for organizations without examining their true purposes. Together with the Survivor Network, they represented the living memory of Raccoon City. They were witnesses to what bioweapons could do, to how corporations could prioritize profit over human life, and to how governments could choose convenience over truth. Their survival carried an obligation to prevent future tragedies. The Nemesis was destroyed, burned in the facility explosion, and then vaporized in Raccoon City's sanitization. But the knowledge that created it remained. Other bioweapons existed in secret facilities around the world. The T-virus and its variants were not unique threats, but examples of an entire category of biological weapons under development by various organizations. Umbrella Corporation was officially dissolved, but its research, resources, and personnel had merely dispersed into new organizations. The bioweapon industry continued, driven by governments seeking military advantages and corporations seeking profits. Raccoon City had demonstrated both the power and the danger of these weapons, providing lessons that some would use to prevent future disasters while others would use to create more effective bioweapons. Jill understood that her fight against bioweapon proliferation would likely continue for the rest of her life. Raccoon City was not an ending, but a beginning, the moment when the threat of biological warfare became undeniably real for her and the other survivors. They would carry forward the memories of those who died, ensuring their deaths served as warning rather than being forgotten in official cover-ups. The city itself was gone, reduced to a crater filled with radioactive debris. No monument marked where Raccoon City had stood. No public memorial honored the dead. The government had erased the city from maps and records, transforming it from a thriving community into an exclusion zone that officially had never been more than a site of industrial contamination. But in the memories of survivors, Raccoon City remained, not as it had been in life, a normal American city with ordinary people living ordinary lives, but as it had become in death, a warning about the dangers of unchecked corporate power, secret bioweapon development, and the willingness of authorities to sacrifice truth for convenience. Jill Valentine had entered Raccoon City as a former STARS officer, fleeing a dying city. She emerged as a survivor, carrying evidence of crimes that demanded justice and a commitment to preventing future outbreaks. The nightmare of September 1998 had ended, but its consequences would echo through the years ahead, shaping her life and the lives of all who survived. The battle against bioweapons had just begun. 2000 to 2003. The investigation years. Jill Valentine spent the years following Raccoon City, working in the shadows, investigating the remnants of Umbrella Corporation and tracking bioweapon proliferation worldwide. She operated without official sanction, using her own resources and the survivor network she had helped build. The work was dangerous, isolating, and often seemed futile against the vast web of corporate and government interests that protected bioweapon research. She traveled extensively, following leads about former Umbrella facilities and personnel. In Europe, she investigated pharmaceutical companies that had acquired Umbrella assets and research data. In Asia, she tracked scientists who had fled prosecution and continued their work under new employers. In South America, she documented secret research facilities operating in regions beyond effective government oversight. Each investigation revealed the same disturbing pattern. Umbrella's bioweapon programs had not ended, but dispersed. The T-virus research continued in scattered facilities worldwide. The Nemesis program's principles were being applied to new bioorganic weapons development. Hunter variants were being bred and tested for military applications. Everything Umbrella had created was being refined and expanded by successor organizations. Chris Redfield worked parallel investigations, focusing on different aspects of the bioweapon network. The two former STARS members stayed in contact, sharing information and occasionally coordinating operations. Their informal partnership proved effective. Chris's aggressive investigative approach complemented Jill's more methodical evidence gathering. Together with other survivors and allies, they disrupted several bioweapon projects during these years. They exposed secret facilities to authorities, leaked evidence to investigative journalists, and directly sabotaged research programs when legal channels failed. These victories were small and often came at significant personal cost, but each one potentially prevented a future Raccoon City. Carlos Oliveira chose a different path. The former UBCS operative joined a legitimate private military company that specialized in disaster response and bioweapon containment. His experience in Raccoon City made him invaluable for training response teams and developing countermeasures. He maintained contact with Jill and Chris, providing intelligence from his position within the security industry. The survivor network expanded significantly during these years. New members joined as other bioweapon incidents occurred, though none matched Raccoon City's scale. Smaller outbreaks happened with troubling frequency. Each incident created more survivors who knew the truth, people who could no longer accept official denials about bioweapon threats. The network operated a secure digital archive documenting bioweapon incidents, corporate malfeasance, and government cover-ups. This archive grew to include thousands of documents, witness testimonies, and physical evidence. Members contributed information from their own investigations, creating a comprehensive resource about the bioweapon industry's global operations. Jill contributed extensively to this archive, uploading detailed accounts of Raccoon City, the Nemesis program, and her subsequent investigations. She knew that if Umbrella's successors eliminated her, this documentation would survive. Other survivors would carry forward the knowledge and continue the fight. During a 2001 investigation in France, Jill uncovered evidence that Umbrella had maintained a secret European research facility that survived the corporation's official dissolution. This facility, hidden in a remote region, continued developing bioorganic weapons under the direction of former Umbrella executives who had escaped prosecution. She infiltrated the facility alone, gathering evidence and documenting the ongoing research programs. What she discovered horrified her. The researchers had learned from Raccoon City's mistakes and were developing containment protocols and control mechanisms for their bioweapons. They were making the weapons more reliable, more controllable, and therefore more likely to be actually deployed. The facility housed experimental subjects that made the Raccoon City mutations seem primitive. Advanced hunters with enhanced intelligence and pack coordination abilities. Tyrant variants designed for specific combat scenarios. And something new, humanoid bioweapons with cognitive functions intact. Soldiers transformed into bioorganic weapons while retaining human intelligence and obedience. Jill realized this last development was the most terrifying. If bioweapons could think and follow orders reliably, governments and corporations would view them as viable military assets rather than dangerous liabilities. The barrier to deployment would disappear, and bioweapon warfare could become normalized. She sabotaged the facility's containment systems and escaped with documentation of the research. The resulting outbreak forced French authorities to intervene, though the incident was officially reported as an industrial accident at a pharmaceutical plant. The facility was destroyed, but the researchers escaped with their knowledge intact. This pattern repeated across multiple investigations. Jill would expose or disrupt a bioweapon program, authorities would respond with minimal action, and the perpetrators would relocate and resume their work elsewhere. The bioweapon industry proved remarkably resilient, adapting to each setback and continuing its research. She grew frustrated with the limitations of working alone and outside official channels. Real progress required governmental cooperation and international legal action, but efforts to engage authorities often resulted in bureaucratic stonewalling or active obstruction. Too many officials had vested interests in maintaining bioweapon research programs or protecting the corporations that conducted it. Chris shared her frustration and proposed a more ambitious solution: create an official organization dedicated to combating bioweapon proliferation. An international body with governmental backing but operational independence, staffed by people with real experience fighting bioorganic weapons. Such an organization could investigate incidents, develop countermeasures, and coordinate responses without the political interference that plagued traditional governmental agencies. The idea seemed impossible given the political realities. But Chris had been cultivating contacts within several governments and international organizations. Some officials, horrified by leaked evidence about Raccoon City and other incidents, supported creating such an organization. A coalition of interested parties began forming, working toward establishing an official counter-bioweapon entity. Jill participated in these discussions while continuing her independent investigations. She provided expertise about bioweapon capabilities, operational requirements for response teams, and political obstacles that would need to be overcome. Her first-hand experience with the Nemesis and other bioweapons made her uniquely qualified to advise on realistic threats and effective countermeasures. During this period, Jill also dealt with personal consequences of Raccoon City. Her physical health remained good, the vaccine had protected her from infection, and she maintained peak conditioning. But psychological scars ran deep. Nightmares persisted, particularly featuring the Nemesis and its relentless pursuit. Loud noises triggered panic responses. Trust came difficult after witnessing so much betrayal and corruption. She attended therapy intermittently, but found it limited in effectiveness. How could a therapist understand trauma from being hunted by an intelligent bioweapon through a city of the dead? The experience was too far outside normal human experience to be fully processed through conventional mental health approaches. Other survivors faced similar challenges. Some succumbed to addiction or depression. Several committed suicide, unable to reconcile their survival with the deaths of so many others. The Survivor Network tried to provide mutual support, but each person's trauma was unique, and their coping mechanisms varied widely. Carlos proved to be one of Jill's most consistent sources of support. The former mercenary understood her experiences in ways others couldn't, having fought beside her in Raccoon City. Their friendship deepened into something more complex, not quite romantic, but closer than typical friendship. They were bonded by shared trauma and commitment to preventing future outbreaks. And that's the full Resident Evil 3 story. Thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video or found it relaxing, please leave a like. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more game stories like this. See you in the next one.